Hey, welcome to Father's Day. I'm Kevin Manning, and we are continuing on in our series titled The Father's Choice. In it, we've been looking over the last few lessons at the person of Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus Christ. And we've been dusting off some of this mythological dust and revealing the real Joseph the man. Joseph the man engaged to Mary, who took her as his wife. Joseph, the man who chose to obey God and adopt Jesus as his son and treat him, not only adopt him as his son, but to treat him actually as his son. And we saw in the last lesson how Joseph actually went above and beyond the call of duty and actually dedicated Jesus unto the Lord as his firstborn son, even though Joseph had no biological connection to Jesus directly. Jesus is not the son of Joseph biologically. He's the son of Joseph legally. So we saw a beautiful side of Joseph's heart. We're going to continue on in our study of Joseph today, and now we're going to look at what that commitment brought into Joseph's life. You see, when we commit ourselves to answering a calling that God may have on our life, whether it's to be a husband or a pastor or a business leader or a father, whatever that calling and purpose that God has for us is, when we answer it, when we commit to it, then things are required of us. God opens opportunities to us that are a great blessing to us, but can also put us in difficult situations where we really can only trust God. And that might sound on the face of it like it's a bad thing. You know, there's nothing you can do about your situation. All you can do is trust God. It sounds to our natural ear, to our natural mind, particularly the modern mind, that might be a bad situation to be in. But scripturally, it is the perfect situation to be in. When you can no longer rely on your own innate abilities or your own resources, and you must rely solely on God who loves you, then you're in the perfect position. You see, you and I, we can lean to our own arm, so to speak, to the strength of our own arm, or to our own abilities, or to our own wisdom and experiences and resources. We can lean to those things and produce outcomes in life. But those outcomes are never perfect. They're never perfect in God's timing. They're never perfect. They're never quite right in the way that things turn out. But when God is our sole source for all of those things, then it all goes according to His timing, His purpose, His provisions, and His plan. And that is always perfect. It's the perfect position to be in. And after Joseph committed, and we saw his heart revealed in the last lesson, we now find him in this position where he must rely solely on God. These are the last few verses we're going to look at. They're actually the last few verses where Joseph is directly mentioned, and we actually see Joseph living and breathing, walking around in this Bible narrative that we're looking at. So these are our last glimpses of him, but they reveal so much about him. There's two places that we can look. One is in Luke chapter 2, about verse 28, verse 38, 39, somewhere in there. Actually, let's go and have a look at it. So in Luke, verse 39. So this is picking up where we left off in the last lesson. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And verse 40, and the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. So we see Joseph and Mary there. They're in Jerusalem. They just fulfilled all of their legal obligations that we saw in the last lesson. And then, bang, they're heading back to Nazareth. But there's a whole story that falls in between these two locations, these two geographical locations. There's a span of time that takes place in between these two that we don't see here in Luke. We must go to the Gospel of Matthew to actually connect these two dots, Jerusalem and Nazareth. So let's connect those two dots. Let's have a look at it and learn something new about Joseph. Again, we're focusing on Joseph. Our intention is to learn as much as we can from Joseph the man, Joseph the father. So in chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew, now this is a chapter that most people, when they read the Bible, they almost blank out. They don't bother really meditating on it or really looking at it, because by default we assume that we know everything that's in there, that we're familiar with it and there's nothing deep and meaningful in there, when the opposite is actually true. There's some beautiful stuff that we as fathers can learn. There's a lot of deep meaning within chapter 2. Some of it we won't get into today, but we'll certainly see it here. Chapter 2 is a very meaty chapter. There's a lot in chapter 2. As a matter of fact, you could make a lengthy mini-series for TV out of just the story that's told in chapter 2. You could make a couple of movies, full-length features, out of the storylines that we see just in chapter 2 alone. So there's a lot there. But we're, again, trying to follow Joseph. Let's follow Joseph through this narrative, Joseph through this story, amid all the things that are happening around him. As I read through chapter 2 and I follow Joseph, I really see a man who is in the middle of a world where everything in his life is, in terms of the way that it might look or might feel, is spinning out of control, out of his control. He can't exert any control over his situation that he finds himself in. In the natural, he's quite powerless to do anything about his situation, but we see him right in the middle of God's hand. Him and Mary and Jesus just right in the middle of God's hand, God's plan, and we see things begin to happen. They are almost surrounded in this bubble of protection as they proceed through what ends up being a very tragic period in history in this part of the world. And the tragedy here is quite often lost in the Christmas narrative. You won't see the tragedy that we're going to see in a minute. You won't see that represented on any Christmas cards or in any Christmas nativities or stories that you read. And yet it's there and it's real. It actually happened, and it is the context in which Joseph, the man, steps up to the plate and relies on God completely for his young family. So let's start in verse 1 of chapter 2. Before we do, there's several things we want to pull out. There are key players that we're going to look at in here. There's a king, King Herod. There's his heir, Archelaus. There's a whole lot of children that we're going to see in a minute. That's where some of the tragedy comes in. We see the chief priests and teachers of the law in Jerusalem. We see them. They play a little cameo appearance. And one of the things that plays a key part in this chapter is some prophets from the Old Testament. They actually feature in this chapter. They're a part of the story because they, in their day and age, hundreds of years before this event, they, by the Spirit of God, foresaw these events and prophesied about them, and then those events become fulfilled. We've talked about it in previous lessons. The Bible is the only book that is self-verifying. It verifies itself through the prophecies that are in it being fulfilled. And I won't go into great detail about that today because we could do multiple lessons on just that one topic, but just be aware the prophets from the Old Testament, many of them, Hosea, they're all playing a part in chapter 2 here. And we begin at verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written." And here's what the prophet wrote, verse 6. And so this is the prophet Micah. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." So that's a beautiful little prophecy. Again, we see Micah, the prophet, actually speaking about this event. It's being fulfilled right now at their time in history. Verse 7, "When Herod called the Magi secretly," again secretly, "and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him.'" Now, King Herod, as we'll see, has no intention of going and worshiping the child. He intends to go and kill his competition. He sees this child king as competition. He doesn't understand the scriptures. He doesn't understand the true meaning of the prophecy and the nature of the king that was actually coming at that point in history. Jesus comes as the Lamb of God here. He's coming to be the sacrifice, to pay for the sins of all mankind once and for all. He's also coming again. He's returning to us at a later date, hopefully not very far away. And that will be a completely different second coming, if you will, completely different from the first. He will come to rule and to reign, and we're looking forward to that. So Herod, just to be aware of it in that segment of scripture that we just read through there, chapter 7 and chapter 8, Herod, from the Magi, has worked out time and place. He knows the time that the child was born and the place that the child was born. And that is a lot of information if your goal is to murder somebody. So Herod has the information that he needs. But he's going to see if he can find out the specific location of where this child is. Also, King Herod wants to play the part of the good king. You know, hey, I'm a religious Jew, aren't I? I want to make sure I play my part. You know, of course I care that this child has been born. He cares, but he cares on a different level. He's not on God's side. He's on Satan's side. Verse 9, "After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh." Now, don't let that gold, frankincense, and myrrh pass by you there. Those are some key items that Joseph and Mary and Jesus are going to need very shortly. But at the moment, they're just gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. "And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route." You see, Satan is working as best he can through King Herod. King Herod, on the surface of things, was a Jew in terms of his religion, but behind the scenes, in the way that he actually worshipped, he worshipped Baal. He worshipped multiple gods, but particularly Baal. At a town called Caesarea Philippi, there were some really awful forms of worship there that involved sacrifice of the firstborn child, so people sacrificing their own firstborn children. There were a lot of heinous things that actually happened at Caesarea Philippi, and that's where Herod spent most of his time.